The Winnipeg Jets have been busy taking care of some business on the back end, and while a number of RFAs have resigned, things might not be in Winnipeg's best interest in the long term. We'll dive into how this might shape Winnipeg's plans going forward and what it means for some of these RFAs who have not exactly gone for term on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, friends, and welcome to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more and visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Now, like I said at the top of the episode, the Jets have been taking care of some business on the back end with a number of restricted free agents. We haven't talked about all of them, but Dylan Samberg, Gabriel Vilardi, and Morgan Barron have all signed. A couple of them have gone to arbitration, and the Jets ended up settling with a shorter term contract. Now, all three players have signed for 2 years, which is a little bit interesting. Usually when you have a situation like this, right, this is kind of like that bridge contract to what a lot of these guys might be hoping is a raise. With, Dylan Samberg, the raise is probably going to be, noticeable, but probably a little bit more modest. If we're talking about Gabriel Vilardi, I think that raise could be pretty significant. So what did these guys sign for to begin with? Well, Dylan Samberg, of course, extended for about $1.4 million per season for 2 years, which for those 2 seasons is phenomenal, value in terms of a top 4 defender, essentially giving you 2 seasons worth of really, really, really cheap play. And given how good Samberg has been on the defense, we all know that's pretty impressive for the value that you're getting those next 2 seasons. Morgan Barron has also re-signed, and the Jets got him locked up for 2 seasons at $1.35 million per season. And then Gabriel Vilardi came out just a little bit ago at 2 years and a little over $3.4 million per season. So you notice all these guys have extended for relatively cheap contracts, but the term is where things start to get interesting. 2 seasons. And in my mind, 2 seasons is... it's not great if you're the Jets, right? This is a really tough position to be in because 2 seasons you're probably not expecting if you were hoping to lock up Vilardi or any of these other players. Barron, I don't think the Jets were really trying to go for a lot of term with, but Vilardi, I would imagine Winnipeg would have preferred at 5 to 6 seasons locked up at a reasonable cap hit. But my guess is, a lot of these players are looking at the cap going up to maybe $90 million in a couple of seasons, and they want to wait it out. And it's hard to really blame them, right? These guys are looking for a raise. They're going to want to have a solid bridge towards that end and make sure that they get paid on their next contract. The problem for Winnipeg is that Vilardi in particular, he's going to be another situation where he's going to be 1 year out from UFA status, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on the Jets to try and, get a deal done before then. Now, if he doesn't want to stay, you could be walking into another Pierre-Luc Dubois situation. I don't envision that being the case this time. I feel like Vilardi might not be the kind of guy who's really keen to fly, but maybe he wants to leave. Maybe he doesn't really want to commit to the Jets. I can understand in some respects if he looks at this team and what's, happened over the past couple of seasons, and maybe he feels a little bit more hesitant to put himself here long term. But in the meantime, the Jets are getting 3 great players at really good value contracts. Barron in particular, I think, has the potential to be a really good middle six player in terms of a guy who is really close to putting it all together. I've said in the past, the only thing he really lacks is just finishing. That's the only thing in Barron's game that hasn't quite seemed to click. And at times, it didn't matter last year because he was creating so many good chances down low. He had great passes, and he even chipped in a few goals and assists. But I feel like if he adds that finishing element that was one of the only things missing from his season last year, I could envision him becoming a guy that you might want to bring back for like 3 or 4 years after that. Barron, I'm very high on as a player who I think is like, the Andrew Copp replacement. We had kind of hoped it was going to be Appleton, and that didn't really materialize in the way that I think we were expecting. But so far, so good with Barron. The season, that he just had really highlighted a step forward. And personally, I'm pretty excited for his next year. I have had him as a guy who I could imagine having a bit of a breakout season. I think that he's right on the verge of being really impressive. But as it is right now, for those 2 seasons, you're getting a really good middle six player at almost no real cost. And, I've already said the same for Samberg. Dylan, obviously, is a really quality second pairing defender, maybe our best overall defender, and a guy who could, for the next 2 seasons, really anchor the number 3 or 4 spot on the blue line should the Jets maybe move some salary out. Vilardi, I feel like, so long as he stays healthy and is able to play out the season, I think, for $3.4 million is technically a steal. Now, that does come with a caveat that after the steal ends, things get dicey very quickly. And so I think it's really important for the Jets to think about, over the next couple of seasons, how do we take advantage of what could be a very favorable cap situation? Wheeler's been bought out. The Jets might have some, flexibility to move out a couple of the blue liners who are currently eating up a fair amount of cap space. That might give the Jets some thought as to maybe taking a real run at it. We'll dive into why I feel like Winnipeg really should consider changing plans and altering how they approach this season. And I'm going to say this already. It's not that I'm a particular fan of this, but based on, what the Jets have said and what the trade market looks like, this might be the best option if Winnipeg really doesn't feel that other stuff is going to fall into place the way that they were hoping for ahead of the season. We'll talk about what could change in just a little bit, but before we go any further, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. All you have to do is just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets back, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. For you Jays fans, obviously, been a bit of a rocky season, but you're hoping that maybe they finish top 3 in the AL East. As an O's fan myself, I'm hoping that the bullpen survives, and maybe it's time for both sleeves. But no matter what you're interested in, you can do so on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly, only with FanDuel. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Jets fans, thank you for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are talking about the RFAs that have extended and maybe some change in plans to how the Jets are going to approach the next season or two. Now, we just talked about Vilardi, Samberg, and Barron signing for 2 years, and I think that is a very clear indicator of players who are kind of betting on themselves and looking ahead at, 2 seasons down the road. The cap might be around $90 million at that point, which would be great if you're a free agent. For the Jets, maybe not so great if we're being honest. Financially speaking, I know everyone will always say that the Jets have an extremely rich ownership group, and that is very much true. But we all know that when it comes to actual operating funds and budgeting, the Jets have some tighter restrictions than a lot of other teams. So, this situation isn't ideal, especially when you're talking about, the next crop of young talent needing big raises. And to that point, you're also now looking at a situation where Scheifele and Hellebuyck so far appear to be starting the season in Winnipeg. all of this to me is starting to point to the notion that the Jets really should be thinking about going all in this season. I know that it's really risky, and I think in my mind it's not how I would do it. But if the Jets are looking at the trade market, they're seeing that both Scheifele and Hellebuyck aren't really getting great returns, which is probably the case because we all knew that Hellebuyck probably wasn't going to bring back a king's ransom anyways. And Scheifele, for as great as he is ultimately still a rental. You're just not going to get a lot for those kinds of assets. And I think that's where the Jets have really run into this question of, okay, if we can't trade them for what we're asking for, is it really worth getting rid of them immediately, right? Should we just ride into the trade deadline and make a decision then? Now, obviously, when you get to the trade deadline, you might run into even more diminishing returns. I don't know that teams are really going to be in a bidding war for either of these players. I can imagine that there will be plenty of suitors, but I just don't know that, come trade deadline, the Jets are really going to be getting crazy, knock your socks off offers. And I think the other question is, where are the Jets going to be at that point in the season? Are they going to be at the top of the Central Division? Are they going to be in the middle of the pack? Are they going to be fighting for a wild card spot? Or are they going to be out of the playoffs completely? And that is going to heavily influence what decision I think they choose. Now, for me, and I'm going to preface this by saying this is not my first choice, but if this is how Winnipeg wants to play it, if they want to go for the playoffs, then I really feel like you got to put all of the chips on the table and really chase it this season. I really feel like, going halfway like the Jets have usually done just isn't going to work. I think Winnipeg should kind of go back to the 17-18 team, look at what made that team really successful, and think about investing in some upgrades. Obviously, the blue line is probably the single biggest area where the Jets still have some work to do. Like the forward group, I think the forward group is pretty darn good. And defensively speaking, I think that unit has also improved pretty significantly. Scoring depth has really improved. But the blue line is still kind of a question. The Jets don't have a clear number one outside of Morrissey. And obviously, I love Joe Moe, and I think he is an elite number one. But, for as much as I love him, right, you look at Adam Fox, you look at Cale Makar, some of these other guys, and they're doing just a little bit more to become like franchise-level defenders. And I think Morrissey is maybe just under a little bit. I'm not going to say that he's not a franchise defender. I think he's fantastic, and I think he's really shown growth. But past Morrissey, you start to realize the depth kind of falls off. Pionk is really struggling. At times, he puts up numbers that aren't really that dissimilar from Tyler Myers. You've got Brendan Dillon, who, again, is, like I've said before in the past, stout defender, maybe not so helpful when it comes to advancing the puck. Nate Schmidt also, I feel, has really been disappointing for me. I was hoping for a lot more from Nate, and he just really hasn't clicked. And you look at his cap hit and the cap hits for the other guys, and you realize that there's a lot of money on this blue line in 3 to 4 players, and not more than maybe one of them is really delivering what they're being paid for. Not to say that they're like failing expectations, but in terms of like your value on the ice, right? What are you bringing game in and game out? It's just not really working in terms of their contract status. So the Jets are going to have to figure out how to open up some cap space. And I think not only would that help with the blue line and maybe finding some upgrades, but it would also give the Jets some room to maybe bring in a big rental. I think this is a year where they really should start thinking about going for all of it, especially if they're in a playoff spot come the trade deadline. And I don't just mean a playoff spot. I mean, reasonably near the top of the conference. And this year, the Jets might legitimately be one of the stronger teams in the West. I know, again, that losing Hellebuyck and Scheifele for nothing would kind of be disastrous, but assuming the Jets want to chase a ring, I mean, I just don't see any other way that you can do it without both of them. And maybe, if things go really well with this whole season and maybe even a playoff run, maybe both players come back for like 4 to 5 years. I think if you get them in like that 5-year contract extension for both, that's where I'm a lot more comfortable. I think more than that, you start to ask some questions, but 5-ish years, I think would be pretty good timing for what's coming for the Jets, especially with the prospect pipeline. But obviously, this Jets team has a lot of questions and not many answers, if we're being honest. I think this offseason has been characterized by uncertainty, and I think it's going to keep kind of going down to the wire before we even have like much clarity on what the Jets' plan is. But In a little bit, I thought I would take some time and talk about at least what the road ahead looks like for the Jets and how this might shape Winnipeg's upcoming preseason preparations. As believe it or not, we are actually starting to near next season. It's still a ways away, but the Jets are rolling up on it, and it's never too early to start getting hyped about what could be a pretty fun Winnipeg Jets season. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you for joining us on these closing thoughts in tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. I just wanted to spend a few minutes closing out tonight's episode with some thoughts on how the Jets might be preparing for the upcoming preseason, right? This, I think, is one of the most intriguing off seasons we've had because we had the Dubois trade. We've had some free agents who have re-signed, but not with a lot of term. Almost everyone has kind of elected for 2 years. And that really gives you a sense of Winnipeg's competitive window, especially with this current core as it is. And make no mistake, forward-wise, this is a good group. Defense-wise, it's questionable. Goaltending, though, you've got Brossoit and Hellebuyck, and so long as Helly stays for this season, that's pretty darn amazing and almost unbeatable. Now, for the Jets, I feel like preseason is going to be a really big moment to see where Brad Lambert, Rutger McGroarty, and a few other guys are. McGroarty obviously has been the star in training camp thanks to his really fun personality and everything. I forget if his NCAA status prevents him from doing preseason. That's always a really gray area because a lot of college athletes are limited in what they can do and what sort of camps and preseason stuff that they can show up for. And McGroarty might be on that list. I forget. That stuff is always very complicated, and I'm sure teams love having to deal with it every season. But otherwise, Lambert and Chibrikov and a few other guys, I think the Jets are really going to want to take a close look at and see if maybe they start to compete for roster spots this year. I think with Lambert, the main thing that they want to see is he ready to go back to pro? In terms of his WHL performance for the Thunderbirds, there was no question that he just tore that league a new one. Lambert regained confidence. He looked assertive, and he really just dominated the competition. With Chibrikov, I think a lot of people are going to be really surprised at just how good he is. He should be obviously a player who anchors that Moose top six, but there's a chance that if he has a really strong preseason, he might even compete for like a third or a fourth line spot. And I think this is going to be a really important time for the Jets to start figuring out if maybe they have some pieces who might be better served, getting a change of scenery. Appleton, for me, I think is one of those players because he's actually making quite a bit, and his cap hit's not small, which for the Jets is a little bit of an eyesore when it comes to trying to maybe bring in an extra rental or something. And, while Mason in the past has been really decent and a fun player, I think what we've seen recently just hasn't been the kind of performance that the Jets really need. And, Winnipeg ultimately, kind of needs to decide how they're going to approach this blue line. If they do keep it as it is, I think the Jets are going to have a pretty good season, but I think that blue line is going to be not necessarily an Achilles heel, but something that holds them back from really reaching that next level. For me, if the road ahead is to be really successful, they kind of need to start with figuring out how to move Schmidt. I love Nate. I think that his personality is astounding. I love him to death. I think he's a great guy in the room. But, for like almost $6 million in cap space, it just hasn't been the sort of performance that I was really hoping from him. He's had games where he's shown in a positive light, and I think there are moments where you can see the version of him that used to play for the Knights, but the version of him that the Jets have, I think you kind of get the sense, right? You know what it is. The score. And it's not really surprising that things haven't quite gone according to plan. Dylan, at least, I think would actually fetch a decent return, maybe a second-round pick or something. And as much as I think he's actually done a pretty darn good job for this team, for $4 million, you got to have a little bit more versatility. And while Dylan has actually tried to grow his game a lot for the Jets, and I feel like has maybe even done some things that are a little bit underrated, overall, I would prefer to maybe start looking internally because you've got guys like Chisholm, right, who require waivers, and that's going to be tough for the Jets this year because you don't want to lose him. Now, Chisholm also is, for me, is a little raw. I know a lot of people will always point to Heinola as having a lot of mistakes in this game. Well, trust me, Chisholm is going to be like that too. Maybe at times even worse. But, you want to give a lot of these prospects really good opportunities to make the team. I think it would be really important for at least one of the other young blue line prospects to filter into this team this year, because the Jets have actually drafted well in terms with, like puck movers, right? Salamonson looks really strong. Heinola, we know, has been obliterating the AHL for the past year or two. And Chisholm has the potential to become a really solid third pairing blue liner. Maybe not second pairing or first pairing, but at least on the back end, a guy who could be a really good internal upgrade and give the Jets some more jump, maybe even on the power play too. And that's obviously an area where I think Winnipeg could really improve. So if the Jets can work on upgrading a piece or two on the blue line, I think this Jets squad going into next year would fill me with a lot more confidence, especially if they decide to keep Scheifele and Hellebuyck. If they don't, I feel like keeping both of those guys could bite Winnipeg in the butt. But if they do make the right changes and make some adjustments, Winnipeg might legitimately be a cup contender again. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We need to just be measured with how the Jets historically have been in terms of roster upgrades. But hey, maybe this is a season where they surprise us. Let me know who you want the Jets to acquire in the comments below, or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Maybe pick out a D or two that you think would really upgrade Winnipeg's blue line, and we'll talk about on the next episode how that might impact and reshape Winnipeg's defensive strategy. But for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you back here tomorrow and Friday for even more off-season coverage, so do not go away. Have a great night, and go Jets go.